Hello, everyone. It's Leah. I was hoping to be with you during this class, but unfortunately, I am driving somewhere between Maryland and Connecticut. And by the time this class is taking place, I will probably be somewhere in southern New York. I'm driving up to see my family for my school's spring break, and since I'm the only driver, it wouldn't be safe for me or the kids in the back seat to be doing this while on the road. So I'm recording this instead. So thank you to Dr. Woods for allowing me to do this way. I'm sorry I'm not there with you, but it's going to be all right. This is probably better. I wanted to send a special thank you to Melissa for being the only person to leave a comment on my paper. I have to think it's probably because my paper's topic is a little on the pedantic side. It is about the need for clarity in philosophy. Now, I am a history major. This is my fourth degree, and all of them have either been in the humanities or history. So I'm a little bit good with dates, and I'm a little bit good with names, a little bit good with battles, I'm a little bit good with those kind of facts and figures. What I'm not good at is the philosophy part, where we're sitting down and we're thinking about how we think. And I've had trouble with it all the way through. Especially there was one point where I took the philosophical inquiry class. If you haven't taken it yet, you will, with Dr. Linville. And the problem was that I was describing to a fellow classmate how much I disliked philosophy and all the ways that I was bad at it, right as the professor walked into the class. So that was not my finest moment. But I wanted to go ahead and talk to you guys a little bit about my paper. A problem that I usually have with philosophy is that a lot of the terms, depending on the philosopher, can be ambiguous, interchangeable even, and we don't always know exactly what it is that they're talking about or the point they're trying to get at. And that's not so good for something that would be considered one of the sciences, or was at one point. I have some notes here from my prospectus that I wrote about how philosophical inquiry operates primarily through argument, interpretation, and conceptual analysis. But without well-defined terms, those goals of philosophy like truth-seeking, evaluation, reasoning can be subverted. It's incredibly difficult to educate others on subjects that you don't fully understand yourself, and mastery of any form of philosophical inquiry would be nearly impossible if the terms are ill-defined. So if you don't fully grasp those terms, then the point of any argument or contemplation of the term becomes moot. It's a futile exercise because it brings about no clarity and can confound the issues even further from where they began. The issues with this need for philosophical clarity is that the problem is that first, it enables resolution of conceptual disputes by identifying and eliminating ambiguity. We need clarity in order to understand, to minimize confusion, and to even the playing field when it comes to these discussions. Great thoughts might be left behind by someone who isn't fully sure that they comprehend an idea the same way that someone else does. Brilliance will be lost. Second, it facilitates productive dialogue across historical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries. And these discussions are essential and part of the reason why we're in this program. It ensures that all can participate in these conversations on an equal footing. We all know what we're talking about. We can engage each other the right way. Third, it provides a safeguard against intellectual dogmatism by rendering assumptions transparent. Great ideas are not the playground of the knowers versus the know-nots. We can eliminate so much confusion about the ideas by making clarity of the terms an essential part of philosophy. Over the course of my paper, I talked a good bit about Aristotle's categories. Now, we read this at the beginning of the semester, and it was one of the first times that I read a philosophical work that brought down into layman's terms some of the ways that we can define these big ideas that we've been discussing throughout the course of the program. Descartes and Locke both have methods that they use to go ahead and break down some of these terms to define them more easily for their readers, so that they can have clarity and make greater sense. and engage better debate. Also, I do a little bit of criticizing of Plato's Republic and Heidegger's Being and Time. We've all read Plato. I think we've all had to read Plato maybe 2 or 3 times by this point. And there are some terms that he discusses in his book that are just not defined as clearly as they could be to engage the audience better and to bring about greater dialogue. They may have been part of his school of wanting to bring out more information and bring out greater information from his students. But later on through the course of time, if we don't have greater clarity, we lose so much participation in those conversations that we could have had if they had been divined better. Let's see here. In my paper, I'm talking about how philosophy is an attempt to make sense of things. And making sense of things presupposes linguistic intelligibility. I'm not going to come straight out and say that some of these philosophers were using terms that were unintelligible. Of course they were. But they could have been worked in their works in such a way that we could understand them better, to make use of them better. They don't belong just in the realm of knowledge and contemplation. Some of these ideas are real world, useful thoughts and ideas that we could be employing if we had a greater understanding of how they meant those terms to be used then and today. The work of philosophers like Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, they reoriented philosophical practice around logical analysis and the precise use of language. I understand that part of what brings some of us to philosophy is the great thoughts and the deep contemplation about it, not necessarily flowery language. If we could make it more precise, then we would have a greater range of ideas that can all be brought to fruit. They believed that some of these classical philosophical problems could have been dissolved if they had clearer conceptual frameworks. If they had been clearer from the beginning, some of these big ideas may not have been so hard to understand or remain so difficult. When we were talking about Aristotle's categories, he introduced, there were 10 of them. I know that there was substance, quantity, and relation, and we were able to divide up some of the thoughts and some of those ideas into the framework, and not just the categories. And it's not about shoehorning them into any specific area so that we can, make this idea fit into our preconceived notions of what it should be. But it's more about defining them so that everyone is on the same page about it. Jonathan Barnes was talking about categories also, and decided that before engaging a philosophical problem, one must clarify the terms of the debate and their ontological commitments. Well, we do that in debate now. You don't go ahead and you throw a vague idea at someone who's about to engage in a debate. They want to make sure that they are discussing the exact same thing as their opponent. And they still do. I'm sure they did then. There would be no point if we had 2 separate people who were discussing 2 different issues under the guise of having them be the same. That's not a debate. That's a zoo. There was a bit there for Descartes, who only those beliefs that are clear and distinct can be accepted as true. And the process of philosophical inquiry consists in purifying the intellect of confusion and prejudice. Well, that's an interesting thought, because if something cannot be defined clearly, then according to Descartes, it must be false. There are lots of terms that I can't define clearly, but I know that they're factual things. So there's an idea there that we have to be able to define it clearly in order for it to be true. John Locke wrote Concerning Human Understanding, which is actually a book that I'm reading for a different class, who talked about how many philosophical disputes arise from the misuse of language and the failure to define terms properly. Would we have so much confusion about philosophy in the greater sense if we went ahead and took care of these issues beforehand? He was discussing the imperfection of words and the confusion that results from imprecise speech. which we also still see today. So there's a good bit of looking at ancient philosophers and even middle philosophers in comparison to ideas that we just still discuss now. In Plato's Republic, particularly in those early books, Socrates wants to define justice. I know that we talked about this in a different class. I don't know if some of you have been in there with me, but where we talk about justice and the different ways that it can be defined. And he talks about how there are various definitions that are offered up as part of the dialogue. Justice as truth-telling, as giving each other their due, is the interest of the stronger. But he never really comes to a conclusion about what it means. So at the end, we're kind of left with come to your own conclusions there. He also talks about Martin Heidegger's being in time, which was an interesting read because Heidegger goes ahead and he brings up, instead of clarifying terms, he makes up his own. He's talking about the question of being. Heidegger is. And he, instead of bringing it down to clarity, making a definition that can be easily understood by his readers, he starts creating new terms, the Dasein, being in the world, and he starts using the word authenticity for being. But other writers have already gone in and questioning whether or not this is solving the problem or really just making the issue worse. Debates over concepts like autonomy or personhood or rights, these are issues that we deal with now. This is a prime example of why we need to define terms, especially when they get into the public lexicon. People start using these terms, throwing words around that maybe they all don't attribute the same meaning to, and making issues worse. We're making dialogue and debate, and we've all seen video clips where dialogue and debate is really going downhill because now it's more a question of volume rather than making sure that we're all coming with the same understanding of the same ideas and being able to dispute them fairly and knowledgeably. So these ideas are applicable. They're not just put into the library of these old philosophers. Is that even now we need to be concerned with making sure that we are defining them accurately. Wittgenstein said that philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. There's a section of my paper where I talk about how sometimes this ambiguity may have been left in intentionally, that it wasn't in the best interest of the philosopher to bring about clarity. Either they were deliberately confusing issues by bogging them down in confusing language to either win shots over a debate opponent or to make themselves appear more knowledgeable. And we sometimes see that today too. Think presidential debates, whether someone's trying to take cheap shots at an opponent, whereas it could just be an issue of this one person defines nuanced of these words differently than someone else does, these ideas. But ultimately, clarity is not a constraint on the philosophical imagination, but the condition under which philosophical insight can be communicated, contested, and refined, so that we all know that we're all talking about the same thing. There's no other way that we can successfully have debates and conversation and to grow these great ideas, which is ultimately what we're doing in a program like this, if we're not able to understand them at their most fundamental. So I hope you guys have a good night, and I will see you next time. Bye.